All right. Hey, David McBride here from Course 5 Intelligence. I believe we're live. Anise, how are you?
It looks like I'm having some internet issues.
Okay, cool. Well, that's how it works when you speak to the billions of people on the planet with the access to the internet live across YouTube and Facebook and Twitter. This is pretty exciting. I'm David McBride, SVP of Digital Solutions and Consulting at Course 5 Intelligence. Um, I'm joined today by my colleague and partner in crime at Course 5 Intelligence, Anise Merchant, our EVP and Global Head of Business. Hi, Anise.
Hi, David. Nice to join you
How are
here
you?
on YouTube.
Yeah, this is pretty cool, right?
It is. It's our first, and let's see how we do it.
Yeah, exactly. Trial and error, A/B test. So we're excited to bring you our first live video broadcast. We've done webinars, we've done events, but this is different. We're
Mhm.
broadcasting on YouTube, on Facebook, on Twitter, all at the same time. And the reach of these platforms is staggering. YouTube has 2.0, about 2 billion monthly active users. Facebook has 2.7 billion monthly active users. Twitter has 300 plus million monthly active users. Um, there are 4.6 billion people in the world with access to the internet, which is about 60% of the world's total population. So our potential reach here, Anise, is billions. We have no excuse to not have a huge audience here. What do you think?
Yeah, but before you do that, how do you feel like being a YouTube star? There are a lot of
Oh man,
young folks who become YouTube stars, and I think both of us are old enough to do this.
I don't know. I mean, my kids probably won't think too kindly of it. They'll be very jealous if it turned out to be me. Um, they can have TikTok. How about that? I'll take YouTube. They can take TikTok.
Oh yes, definitely.
So all,
TikTok is big now.
all we have to do is provide some really compelling content, and then if you build it, they will come.
Yes, it's it's all idea about giving back, and I think this is one of our medium where you and I, and naturally as we go through this entire process, we will have many more individuals who would join us on this journey of giving back and sharing whatever we know and whatever we can as through this entire process.
I agree. I think one of the reasons we wanted to do this is that we find ourselves having really interesting conversations, and we thought, well, why not kind of open it up and have a conversation and with each other, with guests on future versions of this. Um, so what we're planning to do is bring to the world of the internet, to these channels, some interesting topics, some things
Hmm.
that we find compelling and exciting, and we'll share our thoughts and get thoughts from others. Um, and hopefully everyone else that tunes in will find it interesting as well. Um, we wanted to start with a topic today that is near and dear to my heart, that I find is just, it opens my mind every time I go deep into it, and that is scenario planning. Um,
Okay.
so Anis, when you think about scenario planning, what comes to mind for you?
So, David, for me, scenario planning, when I look at scenario planning today within the company, Course 5 Intelligence, at the start of the year or much before the year starts, there is a lot of planning we do now, which may be pertaining to our customers, pertaining to our product, pertaining to our solutions, pertaining to our people, teams. A lot of those scenarios get spoken about and planned. Now, do we really apply the principles of scenarios? You are the experts, or you've done enough research, and the topic is near and dear. So, love to kind of have a discussion and see what I call or what I may be thinking as scenario planning is something which you may be looking at it as well. And since you've written an article also, which I saw coming up on the Course 5 blog on scenario planning, and I did have a read on it. Well, it does align to a few things, but can you shed some light on what you would call a perfect scenario planning exercise to be?
Yeah, so For me, I guess when I think of scenario planning, I think primarily of a two by two matrix. So this was from my experience in business school 20 some odd years ago, where we reviewed a case study where some executives in the 70s at Royal Dutch Shell created purportedly a mechanism for kind of considering scenarios that you might not have otherwise planned for. So they, for this case study, they basically said, okay, let's arrange two different axes, some possible eventual things that might transpire in the world on these independent axes. So on one axis, you might have maybe political stability, for example, and you kind of have a calm on one end of that axis and kind of chaos on the other end of the axis. Maybe that's the x-axis. And then on a y-axis, maybe you would have something like prices, inflation, high and low. And so then you end up with four boxes. And in scenarios where you have a chaotic political environment throughout the world and high inflation, what should an oil company do or an airline company do in that scenario? In a scenario where it's fairly calm politically and inflation is low, what should a company do then? And so that's kind of the model, the framework that stuck with me all these years when I thought of scenario planning. And I came across an article recently from Harvard Business Review by former members of the Shell team, Angela Wilkinson and Roland Coopers. They basically wrote about their experience at Shell and how they did it. This article was from 2013. And they said that this two by two matrix really wasn't a core part of scenario planning. It probably is a good mental model, but what they were really after was this exercise of thinking about, they said, and I'll quote here, they emphasized plausibility, a balance between relevant and challenging scenarios, and memorable storytelling sprinkled with quantitative data. So nice. Here, I guess, is their recipe for scenario planning. It's plausibility. It's something that has the potential to actually happen. A balance between relevant and challenging scenarios, and some kind of a memorable storytelling component to it, sprinkled with data. And actually, as I thought of that, it kind of sounded to me like the recipe for a good sci-fi movie.
I was just thinking about that.
Yeah. So, what do you think?
No, you emphasize on storytelling, which is very key. And if I look in the modern times, and at least in my humble experience of growing up and watching movies, I'm a big sci-fi person. A big fan of Steven Spielberg. Like in my good old days when I was growing up, the famous movie of Back to the Future. It was a great sci-fi movie. Now, if I think about it, 2020, most of those things which he spoke of came to life, whether those were autonomous cars or some cool gadgets which the individual had, flying people, flying shoes. I remembered some of that. And to the recent piece, which was the Ready Player One, where the world can get to with the VR and AR, where there's a virtual world and where people just live in that virtual world. And the advent of technology going in a very different way. But, the reason why I'm thinking about Steven Spielberg is also these scenarios are being told as stories, or these futuristic, probabilistic scenarios are being built either through these mediums or through some thought thinkers or thought providers within the industry, which sometimes in business we don't recognize. And there are people who do recognize, whether it's the autonomous cars or some of the technologies they do. So, just thinking about the current scenario, David, since you brought this topic about scenario planning and the current pandemic, which we are all going in, do you think we could have avoided that? Do you think we could have planned for it better? Do you think organizations or government institutions or other socio-political institutions or human welfare institutions could have planned better using scenario planning exercises, which we have?
Yeah, I've been thinking about that. Like what we're experiencing right now, and I think is some of a bit of a paradox of scenario planning. It's the truth is sometimes said to be stranger than fiction, and the truth that we find ourselves in right now, where we've got a global pandemic and a lockdown and a fair amount of political unrest in various parts of the world, a very interesting election about to take place in the U.S. As we record or as we broadcast this. In it right now, it sort of seems unreal, but at the same time, because we're experiencing it, it doesn't seem as unreal as maybe it would have seemed a year ago. Like if we were hunkered around a whiteboard in our office a year ago, and we said let's consider this scenario where there's a global pandemic. I don't think there's any way that we would have expected it to have unfolded the way that it has, but we would have planned for something like this because we've seen it in movies. Contagion, the movie. We've seen Bill Gates gave a talk several years ago where he said, this is coming. It's at a high level. It's not unheard of. The U.S. government had a very well documented plan for how to respond in this kind of scenario that was maybe not adhered to as much as it could have been so far. And maybe the opportunity going forward is to remedy that. But I do think that we might have come up with this if we had the discipline to have the conversation together about just what might happen.
But even with all these warnings, or even with all these messages, even there was a movie which was all about the pandemic, which did, since we were talking about movies. But there is this element of fear or adversity, which is an extreme adversity. The scenario, it's an extreme adversity. Today, if I look at many organizations, they all have business continuity plans, which I'm sure in your past you've participated in drafting them. And all these business continuity plans had all natural calamities, had other losses, like whether it's the critical human loss within the organization. So what organizations need to aware. Now, if I go and look at any of these BCP plans, I don't think so anybody did a scenario planning for a pandemic of this nature. Now, let's say if I give you a time machine, since we are taking a lot of references of movie and being a big Marvel fan, if I give you a time machine and say, if you were in October 2019, if you go a year
time
back,
heist.
literally. Yes.
We're going to go on a time heist. Okay.
Yes.
Yes.
So if you go back to October 2019, exactly a year before, and what you've been through, how would you undertake a scenario planning exercise?
That's really interesting. I think that there's a certain element of starting with, and you mentioned there's fear involved here. You have to have a willingness to confront hard truths, things that you really don't want to consider. And it's interesting to hear you bring up the Marvel Cinematic Universe here. About a year and a half ago, I gave a talk at one of our customers' annual conventions. They got their e-commerce team together, and I gave a presentation where I basically took the audience. There was a room of maybe 300 people, and I took them on a time heist, sort of hypothetical. I had 3 people from the audience come up, and I sent one of them into the past 20 years ago, one of them into the future 6 months. So this would have been January of 2020 or December of 2019, and the other 20 years into the future. And we had this kind of mental thought exercise around the trajectory of how much things had changed, what had changed over the last 20 years and what hadn't, and what might change over the next 20 years. And I think the hardest one for anyone to share their thoughts on that was the one that had to forecast 6 months into the future. They really, you could conceive of things way in the future. And because science fiction movies have maybe done such a good job of showing us eventualities, possibilities. But the one that I was asking them to think 6 months into the future, it was pretty much status quo from the present moment. So I think it's pretty hard to think what might change from all of the things that could go wrong or could go right with the world. Which ones am I going to focus on? for my decision making right away. And I think it can be helpful to I guess maybe start by thinking by storytelling. Use Hollywood as an inspiration if that helps. And also, you mentioned finance earlier and business financial planning that takes place at the beginning of a year. Financial teams are often really good at high and low kinds of scenarios. So if you added a storytelling component to your finance team, like what would be the scenario that would drive a 50% increase or a 50% decrease in our revenues? What might cause that? And what should we do in response to that? I think too often we just think in terms of let's do the budget to do the budget and think in terms of 5% gains or 10% gains or 15% gains or losses. And we often don't look at the loss because it's a hard truth and we don't want to think about it. We don't budget for loss. We budget for growth. But I think we would benefit from having kind of those harder conversations. And that's what comes to mind for me. What do you think?
No, David, but as I spoke about the fear, there is also a very innate skill today. There is a lot of conversation about AI and technology and how AI can help do some of this, what we are talking about from a scenario planning perspective. But you need that human element to be a wanderer, to question some of these aspects as well. And what I mean by that is like really poking the bear of that fear. Like you said, today, how many of our executives, like you spoke about the financial planning, really do a downward planning instead of a budget planning, which is always an upwards, which is always good news. None of us want to be the bearer of the bad news. At the same time, it's not just finance, but when you think about other departments, what happens if the world comes to a standstill, which it has, and then there's not going to be any marketing. There's not going to be any advertisements. There's not going to be any sales outreach from a perspective that sales are going to be on the field. Or if I just look at the worst hit department or which came into a big purview of many large organizations is supply chain. How would organizations think about supply chain as or relook at their supply chain? Because, the function in itself became a very cost-saving platform rather than what I would call as a innovation or a critical function. Supply chain is critical, but it kind of moved towards a supply and demand and then managing the cost element into it, which kind of restricted its focus largely. And because of that, innovation, thinking or scenario planning also were restricted because it had that North Star, which was probably in the supply chain case was the cost.
So
I don't know.
That's interesting. If I internalize or if I repeat back kind of some of what I'm taking away from that is if we were willing to think about sort of the bear case scenarios, the really sharply negative scenarios, poke the bear, then we might that might open our minds to being willing to consider more, I guess, drastic what if scenarios. Maybe the black swans, as we sometimes read about. And it's hard to think exactly what that would be, but just the fact that there might be something that contributes to that. So what does that mean for my supply chain? Where should I take advantage of? What are the opportunities I can take advantage of? And one thing that I've observed as a consumer and also in our business is that the businesses that are really doing well here are those that are over communicating with their customers. They're treating the customer with a lot of respect, saying, "Okay, I recognize this is a difficult time," and I think we all got a little tired of all the emails recognizing that early on. But then if that's followed up with some really meaningful phrases or action, I think that gets interesting. I think that there's so much data out there and data that's available through supply chain. I've noticed that with some scenario or with some companies that I purchase for or that we work with, they're doing a really good job of telling me when a product is either scheduled to be delivered or when it has been delivered.
Mm-hmm.
They make it easy for me to send it back. I returned something recently through the reverse supply chain, and about
Mm-hmm.
15 minutes after I dropped it off at the UPS store, I got an email saying, we received your product. So clearly that company had not received the product, but they had extended their boundaries and their data flows to
Yep.
recognize what receipt of the product was. And so this is where leveraging the data opportunity can in any scenario be helpful in more fully, more richly communicating with customers to alleviate their fears.
So you see, you brought out a very interesting point about data, David, and and it's all good when you are in that scenario and you're trying to leverage the plan which you have to do that. But when you talk about scenario planning as an exercise, okay, uh, and there is no data for certain scenarios,
Hmm.
uh, like the current pandemic, which people are saying has happened about 100 years ago. Now, I don't think so. We have data around that element. Uh, so how do you, and this kind of talks about it's not just data, but also how do organizations think about scenario planning? What are the key recipes to do an effective scenario planning if somebody is planning to do that?
Yeah, so I think there's 5 or 6 key tips and tricks I think that come to mind for me. That before we got together here, I took the time to write down. So the first one is really that companies should collaborate. Individuals should make time to get together to talk about these things. Now, an individual can start on their own, but it's most helpful and frankly most enjoyable if they're doing it together. And back in the day when we were all working in the same offices, you could do that around a whiteboard. Well, there are certainly many digital equivalents of whiteboards, Miro or Google's Jamboard, to name just 2. So there are many ways to collaborate across
Mm-hmm.
distance and using digital tools. Another is, you mentioned sometimes there's a paucity of actual data, but there isn't really a paucity of storytelling of stories. And even though truth might be stranger than fiction, fiction can be a good jumping off point. And I think it's helpful to get your creative juices flowing, to think about what might be possible, to think about examples from the world of Hollywood. On one hand, we often talk about Minority Report. Okay, fine. So that's kind of a mix of what's possible in marketing with a dystopian sort of crime type of story. You've got the Star Trek
Yeah.
Federation. That's an interesting story you could rely on. You've got Children of Men or Blade Runner. These all offer sort of what might happen in the distant future. Well, you could rewind that back to the present.
And David, just based on that, something which is available today is a lot of today applications of analytics techniques or AI techniques which allow you to bring in these references, not the actual movie, but these data points which can be arbitrary or because today even in business scenario, whether it is marketing, whether it is sales, or whether it is finance, they may have not captured that data, but they can bring these data points and let the methods go ahead and say how would these scenarios or these data points influence an organization from a decision or the area which they're trying to influence on. So there is that, and my favorite method is Bayesian methods, which allow you to do that, where you can bring in these practices or you can bring in these data points to build these factors and as these custom conditional factors, which can allow you to program within your model, which you're trying to build.
Right. Yeah, so I think the data aspect of it, the quantification side is interesting. And by the way, let me pause here and encourage anyone who's viewing to feel free to let us know where they're watching from. Feel free to ask any questions. We'll open it up for any questions that we might have received from the audience here in a minute. So once you've decided to collaborate, you've got some digital tools in place, you've got some storytelling juices, you're feeling creative about being expansive in terms of what might happen in the future. I think it's helpful to bring it a little closer to home, to think through what are some of your most cherished assumptions. Maybe if the stability of your government is something that you have been able to count on your whole life, maybe you should challenge that assumption. What happens if we enter an area of political unrest and more than just protesting around a single issue, but something more significant than that? What do you do for your business in that scenario?
Mm-hmm.
How do you connect to your customers? So you sort of take that cherished assumption and then you flip it on its head. Another one might be, actually, I'm reading a really interesting book about climate change, The Uninhabitable Earth, which tells a very stark picture about what we can expect from a global warming perspective over the next 20 plus years. And one of my cherished assumptions has been that technology will help us find solutions to climate change. Well, what if it doesn't? What do we do then? And I think it's incumbent on all of us as business leaders to challenge some of those assumptions. And clearly, one need look 20 years into the future to find scenarios where your supply chain, where your customer relationships, where your customers' lives are thrown into disarray because of climate change. So I think we should sort of take those cherished assumptions and flip them on our head and then consider those scenarios.
Yeah, since you wanted to talk about the book, I wanted to share this book, The Alliance, which was actually referred by Ashwin, who's our CEO, to read. And one of the key things, part of scenario planning, as I think more about it, is team and the kind of people you bring in. And you spoke about collaboration earlier. It is critical that it is not just data or executives, but people from different facets, and that's where diversity and inclusion really plays a big role, where you bring in people from variety of backgrounds and variety of experience, and even with no experience, actually, these individuals who do not have any experience, but what I would call them as wanderers, who do not have any presumptions or a past experience, but they can think about scenarios which many of us grown up may not have thought about.
Right.
Or, how do you build that right team or bring in that team to do this exercise? But there's one thing which has kind of been going on in my mind, David, and something which, since you've been doing this for some time, we spoke about once in a year when we do financial planning, but how often do organizations need to do the scenario planning? Is it every month? Because getting these teams, data, spend time, whiteboards, or now doing it virtual, how often, since we're talking about tips and thoughts, how often should we do it? Is it once a year? Once in 3 months?
Yeah. So you could have a strategy / scenario, or scenario planning could be a function of a strategy team that always exists, and they're always refreshing a strategy. They might look at it as a wave. My thinking is that if you look at it as an annual exercise, that's better than not doing it at all. But that you might find yourself just doing it to check off the box and not being sufficiently expansive. However, if you are willing to, during that annual exercise, sort of say, okay, we really need to challenge some of our key assumptions this time around. We need to build on the scenarios we considered last time to be a bit more. In fact, if there's anything the pandemic has shown us, it's that we should maybe be a bit more expansive about what we consider. I'm not suggesting that all companies need to allocate people full time to this, or that doing it only once a year is not the right thing. But similar to a data governance committee, which I could see meeting on a quarterly basis, if you have people for whom this is, it can be a mix of responsibility and hobby almost within a corporate sense. It can really, because it's so creative in nature, people who don't often get to use their creative juices can do so. And a quarterly cadence seems to me to be entirely appropriate. And maybe it doesn't have to be formal in that quarterly cadence. It could be a lunch and learn kind of session, or not even lunch and learn, but you grab lunch together and thinking forward to a future where we can actually spend time face to face. But you could also do the same thing via a collaborative tool, and sort of have a conversation in a slightly less I guess, regimented format.
Mhm.
So, it seems
Yeah.
to me like a quarterly cadence where people are just naturally getting together seems like a good way to start.
And thinking more aloud right now, since you was talking about this, and just thinking about the current work, and not just within the organization, but with clients as well. Uh, it is critical today. It's not just for the strategy team. Also, you spoke about the strategy team. It's also about if I'm running a product function, or even if I'm running a marketing function. Scenario planning may not be an elaborate exercise, but like you said, it can be
Mhm.
a learn to learn where we talk about possibilities. Like, for example, TikTok. When TikTok came in, there were many people who waited and watched. Okay, let's see how it grows. Should we participate? Should we not participate? Or whereas there are enhancements happening in platforms like Facebook or Instagram where they are launching new features, or let's say LinkedIn's new feature of the stories which they have launched. uh, you know these scenarios may not be large, but these scenarios can be happening real time. And how do you bring in that culture of scenario planning, and start small and let that be habitual, like you said.
Right.
Even in these small teams or small setups, so that it allows you to get into a habit, and tomorrow as you move forward, you're much aligned to the overall aspect of you know driving a larger scenarios. And we are all human beings, we do make mistakes, and we are not fortune tellers who can, we don't have those powers. But if we have that exercise nailed within our organization on building these scenarios, and even if it is happening real time or we can predict something in the future, uh, even if something pandemic what has hit her probably hits us again in the future, we will be leveraging scenario planning as a platform to allow us to build multiple scenarios from there to
Yeah.
say, okay, what can be done? Because
Yeah.
I
It's
think, no, go
please go
ahead.
ahead. I'll let you finish.
So because if I just look at the month of Feb and March, there was warning, but nobody thought, nobody planned for it. It was just like, okay, let's wait and watch for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 6 weeks, and slowly it started building upon us. And because of the scenario which it was, and it's not just me, but for everyone around the world, we kind of started getting pressurized, and we all went into our own cocoons for the first 3 months. And it took us time to get out of it. But the point, what I'm trying to say is that that habit was there for
Yeah.
larger organizations and all sizes. You know, quickly people could have gone back to the drawing board and say, okay, what if, and what happens if, if this happens, and what would our reaction or action be? So, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I think there's a lot to learn from the last experience. Now is a perfect time to start to think through a scenario planning kind of framework. Um, so I guess just rounding out some of the recommendations and ideas that I had. And actually, before I do that, I want to make a point that this isn't about prediction. This isn't like saying, oh, I predicted, like in 2019, oh, I predicted a
Yeah.
pandemic was going to happen in 2020. It's more
Yeah.
about sort of establishing the discipline of thinking beyond your day to day right now and planning for something that might be materially different,
Hmm.
to the positive or to the negative. We talk about TikTok. That's from a user engagement perspective, that's a dramatically maybe different outcome uh, than I might have expected. My kids were
Yep.
using Musically 4 or 5 years ago, and then they kind of stopped. It sort of went away, and then that company was bought, and the technology and functionality morphed a bit, and now it's blown up because it's fun and a great way to
Yep.
connect. And the algorithm is just so darn accurate that it's just easy to lose yourself in a TikTok hole. So anyway, that sort of scenario of, from maybe if you're a media planner, like what if this thing comes around that's completely different, but people really like it because the algorithm's really good. What if
Hmm.
maybe a scenario is there's lots of challenges to data right now as far as getting it from point A to point B, or data cleanliness and data literacy are big issues. What if we're able to solve those issues? Then what? And then let's work backwards
Hmm.
to see how we can actually make that possible. So it doesn't
Yep.
necessarily have to be about things that happen in the world around you despite your efforts, it can be something that perhaps you decide to work to create a future that you want to enable. So the last kind of pointers and tips and tricks I'll say is that don't get too hung up on quantification. Focus on quantification as a jumping off point. Baselines are great. Global projections are huge. We know there's 7.8 billion people in the world, and 59% of them are using the internet right now. And there's all kinds of high-level predictions around growth rates, and those are great places to start. But don't get too hung up on specific numbers. It is interesting to look back, say, 50 years and think, a certain product, a Big Mac costs X. What's it going to be in 50 years from now? So another suggestion is to have a goal. What are you trying to achieve with all of this? Try to tie that to your work today. We talked about the right cadence, and then the last one that we kind of touched on before is bring others into the conversation. Look for ways to expand the minds number of minds, and then the diversity of people whose minds have been opened through this process. And actually, that's something that I think sometimes we get involved with at Course 5. We specialize in the quantification part of digital transformation. We also bring a great amount of artificial intelligence visionary thinking to our products and to our customers. And that certainly has a great potential impact on a variety of potential futures in the future. And so that's how this works, somewhat how this works in our day-to-day at Course 5. So those were kind of the tips and tricks. Any closing thoughts or anything you want to share as we wrap this up, Anis?
No, the pandemic has definitely brought in a lot of thoughts, and scenario planning is one of the critical tools available to executives and everybody. But hearing you out, David, and something which I, kind of reminded me, these tips and tricks which you were talking about, is earlier this year, not too far back actually, Course 5 had its first virtual town hall with its employees.
Right.
And you were part of it, and we had Jonty Rhodes, who was there, and he shared a lot of great learnings, and one of them, which is kind of like etched in my heart, and which is so true, and the pandemic has really proven that, like he said, you can't control the outcome, or don't go behind controlling the outcome, but focus on the process. And if you focus on the process, the outcomes will be managed. And it is so true. And what you're hinting at, and what you spoke about from a scenario planning perspective, it is that process. It's that bringing in that process culture, process thought process in the organization, so that it allows you to manage it, and the outcomes will be outcomes. There are Murphy laws, there are many such laws which will come and hit you. But if you have your process ironed out, you would be able to manage those outcomes effectively. So I think, that's the closing thought I would love to share from the recent Jonty Rhodes conversation we had.
I love that.
As an organization.
Lessons from the cricket pitch. You can't control the outcome, but you can control the process. And that applies in business as well. And certainly very applicable to scenario planning. It's not about identifying the outcome or predicting what's going to happen. It's more about going through the process of expanding your mind around various possibilities and what are the core investments that you should be making now to be ready for a variety of eventual outcomes. And actually, Course 5, our strategy has been to enable digital transformations with data, analytics, insight to help understand customers. And that's the value that we bring to our customers day in and day out. So it's an exciting space to be. We're all in on data, and that should be a big part of a scenario planning exercise. Storytelling is similarly important, and finding that balance between plausibility, relevant, and challenging scenarios. So exciting topic. Wow, we've been talking for about 40 minutes. It's hard to believe that we've
wow.
It's just good conversations go by quickly.
Yeah.
I think we should wrap it up there. What do you think?
Yeah, let's do it. And I think we should be getting on to being the YouTube star soon. I look forward to that. So no, I think this has been exciting, David. Look forward to many more.
Yeah, me too. Thanks everybody for joining this first inaugural edition of Course 5 Compass Live. We'll be back in a couple of weeks with another thought-provoking topic. Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Stay safe.